Getting back to our camp questions, and we're on number 5. How much does Al Horford have left in the tank? Celtics will need him. How much of him will they have? It's all right now on the Locked On Celtics podcast.
Be ever ready. Recognize the city of champs. Boston, baby, we do what you can't. Locked on number 18, Tatum and Brown, J-team, step back. We gon' wet that and slay teams. Of course the Celtics, who else could it be? Screaming like KG with the Larry O.B. Karalis above average, assessing the team status. Best daily pod, no cap, salary matching. Clutch like Bird the DJ, keep John on replay. Prime time, dapping up the truth on the sideline. Raining J's, how it started, raising banners, how we finished. Locked on Celtics pod, home of the winners. B.
Hey there, welcome back to the Locked On Celtics podcast right here in the Locked On Podcast Network, where it is your team every day. And I am here for you every day, Monday through Friday, with a fresh, free podcast. So subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Watch the show on YouTube. I'd love it if you did that. I'm John Karalis, former professional basketball player, credentialed beat writer covering the Celtics for Boston Sports Journal. I'm now getting into my 16th season covering the Celtics. I've also written a book called The Boston Celtics All-Time All-Stars. Today, getting back to the camp questions, we did all of the Robert Williams stuff yesterday in the podcast. So if you missed that, that was yesterday's podcast. In a nutshell, I don't think it's that big of a deal. Hopefully it's not that big of a deal. If I'm taking everything at face value, I think he'll be okay. He'll only miss a couple of weeks of the season at best. So ready to move on, move forward with the camp questions. Now, I started out the series last week. Will the Celtics be able to handle championship expectations? Robert Williams was question number 2. Could he take another leap, another big step forward? So that, I still think it's possible. Obviously, if this cleans his knee up, then sure. But that's a whole podcast from last week. Talked about question number 3. How will Ime Udoka evolve in his second season? And then, will Brad Stevens feel compelled to make an early move? Those were earlier this week. That was Monday and Tuesday. The Wednesday show was the Robert Williams show. Now we're back to question number 5. Al Horford. How much does Al have left in the tank? And so why do you ask this question at all? Because he's 36 years old. And even after a season where he played, I think, great. I think Al Horford had as good a season as much better than we could have expected. He played 29 minutes, so right in line with what we would expect him to play, just about 30 in the playoffs. He played a lot more. He shot well. He shot 58% from 2, which was his second best season from 2 of all time. And his best season was his last year in Boston before leaving for Philly. So he had these moments where you say, okay, the numbers actually are encouraging. He played 69 games. A couple of those games missed were COVID related. So he played basically a full season. I think when you look at what he did last season, and this kind of plays into Ime evolving as a coach and the question of, did he do what he did last year because he needed to do it? Or did he do what he did last year because that's how he wants to play? They used a lot of Al Horford, double big lineups, Al and Rob, and that worked. The Celtics defense was the best in the league. And the question there is, do the Celtics need to go double big to have that defense? Does Ime believe in double big to make that defense work? Al Horford being the key to a lot of the defense is why you have to ask this question, because they needed him. They needed all of him over the course of the playoffs. And to ask him to replicate all of that from the beginning of the season, I think you're asking too much of a guy who's 36. And if the Celtics make it to the finals, he'll be 37. It's just too much to ask of a player like that to be that much of a focal point of the offense. At the same time, he's part of the formula. He's part of the formula that got the Celtics to the finals. And so immediately there's this quandary for the Celtics, because You need him to be productive. You need Al to be a defensive menace. Last season, Al was really, really good at switching onto guards and holding his own. Now, he wasn't as good as he used to be, but I was really impressed multiple times last year where Al switched onto guards, and I was like, wow, he really is holding his own. I think it was against Brooklyn, the first Kyrie return with Brooklyn, where Al switched onto Kyrie and Kyrie didn't kill him. Al did well enough. And when you're asking your center to switch onto a guard, especially a dynamic guard like Kyrie Irving, who can break anybody off the dribble, to have Horford stay out there and handle those switches onto the perimeter against Brooklyn and against a lot of teams, I think is amazing. Now, obviously, that broke down against Steph Curry. Curry abused Al Horford, and I think that's where things just. I think that's where you start to ask this question, because I think Al, and just like everybody else, was probably running on some fumes by the end and didn't have. He certainly wasn't at 100%, and you saw. Well, Steph saw Al Horford and said, "Ooh, here's lunch," and he just it was too much. That was just one bit too much for Horford to handle, or for anybody to handle on the Celtics for that matter. And so you say, at what point does that breakdown happen this upcoming season? At what point does Al, if he does have that wall that he hits, at what point does it happen? And how do the Celtics prevent that from happening? So the question of what does he have left in the tank, I think, is one of the more legitimate ones of this season. It could very easily be that he has the exact same amount left in the tank and he'll play well and that'll be fine. But I think the realistic and fair thing to think is that you have to treat Al Horford just a little bit differently this season. You have to treat Horford like he's a 36-year-old going into 37, a big man who has had knee issues before, issues with tendonitis before, that soreness in that knee. You have to prepare yourself for a more cautious Al Horford plan. And now that we're doing this with some questions about Robert Williams early on, it just adds a little bit more importance to making sure that Al is at his absolute peak when you need him to be at his peak. So what does all of that entail? What does all of that mean? What do you need to do for Al Horford to be his absolute best? I'll get into some of the things that I think Horford and the Celtics need to focus on to make sure when you answer how much does he have left in the tank, that the answer is a positive one. I'll do that after we talk about BetOnline.net, your number one source for all of your betting info this season, including the most important thing for most bettors, football. Whatever level you're betting on, college, pros, it's all there at BetOnline.net. Find all the latest player developments, team matchups, news, podcasts, and in-depth articles and analysis on every game you can find. And as always, BetOnline remains your continued source for all of your sports wagering information with live betting and up-to-the-minute scores for every sport out there. And that includes the NBA, obviously, once it returns, Major League Baseball, MMA, boxing, and golf. It's the fastest and easiest way to check in on all your favorite games and events. So head on over to betonline.net. You can use your mobile device to learn more. It's all right there at BetOnline, where the game starts. Please gamble responsibly. Hey, thanks for making Locked On Celtics your first listen every day. Make Locked On NBA your second listen every day. Rotating hosts all week. I host on Wednesdays with Jake Madison of the Locked On Pelicans podcast. Big story on today's Locked On NBA is going to be Rob Sarver suspended owner of the Phoenix Suns, now announcing that he is going to be selling the team, selling the Suns, selling the Phoenix Mercury. So that's a big development for Phoenix. How does that change the league? How does that change the team's future? That's all going down on Locked On NBA. Check that out wherever you get your podcasts, wherever you found Locked On Celtics, and it's on YouTube as well. So I've laid out the question. Al Horford, what does he have left in the tank? How can you maximize what he has left in the tank? And I think one of the concerns that I have for Al is they went all in last year because they made this run to the finals, and each step along the way is one step, just one more mile on Horford's legs. And you're able to do that because of the third of the season that he took off in Oklahoma City. And obviously their season ended, no playoffs for them. And so he'd had a couple months off of the regular season, plus all of that off season, that big long stretch of, was it 6, 7, 8 months that he had off? Not off, because he's working out, he's staying in shape. But that helped him heal completely. That helped him be at his absolute best. And he came into Celtics camp feeling rejuvenated. And there was the excitement of, oh my God, I can't believe I'm back in Boston. He had that feeling. You could see it in his eyes. I've talked to him multiple times. I've talked to his family. Everybody in the Horford family was psyched that he was back in Boston. So there's that juice that okay, yeah, he took that contract. He left for Philly. That was a disaster. Then he got traded to OKC, and it's just like you start to accept your fate. I can imagine being in his shoes, and I'm sure there's some night somewhere where Horford has to be like laying on that pillow and saying, I can't believe that I'm going to sleep in OKC and that this could be it. I would have that. I admit, I don't have, there's an NBA mentality. It's like a poker player mentality that I could never get there, but there has to be some of that. There had to be some of that. So when he came to Boston, there's this euphoria and I feel good. My mental state is good. Yeah, let's rock. And he rocked it out the whole season. I am encouraged that he will come back this season as healthy as possible, because there's a couple of things. He's not adding anything to his game. He's not at the point of his career where he's trying to add elements. We talk about Rob adding an offensive element to his game, whether it be post-ups or a mid-range jumper. We talk about Jayson and Jaylen. Are they going to be adding elements to their game? How are they going to be building on what they've done? Al at 36 is like, you know what? This is who I am. All he needs to do is get up shots, keep that form, stay in some level of shape, but not overdo it. You can do all the low impact stuff, your ellipticals, your pool work, anything to take the pressure off of the knees, but still stay in some kind of shape. And that's it. So I'm encouraged that Horford at this point, it's all about just getting the body right, and the game will be there. We know what the game is. He's not asked to do too much. Play your game, and we'll work around that. So that's number one encouraging thing. Number two encouraging thing is that Al is as pro as they get. This guy is a professional. He is a high-level, highly respected pro. He knows what work needs to be done. He goes and he does it. He is as prepared as anybody to do this job. And so I have a tremendous amount of respect for a guy like that. He's been treating his body very, very well all along. You know, he respects the game. He respects what it takes to be at the top of this game. And that's why at 35, going into 36, he was so good. Yeah, his body was right and he had that mental state, but he was also a professional who went out there and he just goes and does what needs to be done. And that's what makes him a great leader. That's what makes him very, very just prepared for whatever is coming. So those two things make me think, obviously, that Al Al will be in as good a shape as possible and prepared to take whatever is coming at him. The downside is time doesn't care. Time doesn't give a crap about your preparation. Time doesn't give a crap about any of that stuff, because eventually you turn 37 and eventually you turn 38. And as a person who is well beyond 38 at this point, I know it doesn't matter what you think or do or how you prepare. Time keeps moving forward and you got no choice. This is just going to happen. Your body will start to break down. Guys don't play forever. That's why guys playing into their 40s is very rare. And at some point, everybody's got to go. Everybody's got to go to make room. That's just life. That's just life in basketball. So at some point, there's just a little bit less left in the tank. I mean, there is always a little bit less in the tank for a player of this age. Just how much less is there? And there is concern that the Celtics don't have enough backing him up, and especially with Rob out early, that there's going to be some pressure on the team to say, hey, let's ride Al a little bit more than we wanted to early. And then when Rob comes back, we can just dial it back down. And I just don't like that. I just don't like hitting the gas that fast on anything. It's too much too soon. If that's what they do, I'll not be happy about it. What the Celtics do, how the Celtics handle that backup role is a big part of how can you preserve Horford moving forward. We talk about Luke Cornett. We talk about Fiondu Kabengele. Talk about Grant Williams maybe getting in there sometime. Noah Vonleh can maybe get in there and get some time. The importance of those guys is getting greater and greater and greater. Not only because Rob is hurt, but because they were going to be important anyway with Al Horford still, he's going to take his time ramping up. His offseason, everybody's offseason is shortened. Al Horford's offseason probably shouldn't be shortened all that much. I think October, November is just one big extended preseason for Al Horford, which means lower minutes, which means back-to-backs off, which means just treating him with those kid gloves to make sure he's ready when you need him to be ready. But without those backups, if you throw Luke Cornett in there and it doesn't work, and if you throw Kabengele in there and it doesn't work, and you throw Vonleh in there and it doesn't work, well, now you're stuck. And that becomes the big gamble for the Celtics. And it's going to be on Brad Stevens to make changes and make them quickly. The biggest responsibility for this Celtics front office is recognizing before any of us when things aren't going to work and making the change in an appropriate amount of time. That is their biggest responsibility this year. It is their biggest challenge. Brad Stevens and the entire front office all of them need to be at these practices and watching them closely to see, is Luke Cornett able to do what we hope he can do? Is Kabengele able to do what we hope he can do? Is Vonleh able to do what we hope he can do? Are those guys capable of this? Because you can't tax Al, and Robert Williams needs to get back and build himself back up and not rush. Brad Stevens needs to have a sense of clairvoyance. If he sees Luke Cornett out there and he's like, yeah, baby, this is exactly what I had hoped for. He's hitting all the right notes. He's setting the right picks. He's making the right plays. He's hitting his shots. Thumbs up. If that works, great. But the second it doesn't seem like it's working, Brad Stevens needs to have a huddle with his front office, and he needs to say, is this something that's just going to take time? In the moment that the consensus is, this isn't it, then you got to switch gears. If Luke's not doing it, then Kabengele's got to get his shot. If he's not doing it and Vonleh's not doing it, they got to make that move. They got to make it right away, and they got to figure out what the hell that move is. Because I don't know what that move is. You go into the season with this kind of setup, you better know what your outlets are. It's the same thing that Ime Udoka talks about when Jaylen Brown and Jayson Tatum drive. If you're going to put your head down and drive into the lane, you better know where your outlets are in case the defense collapses on you. You got to know where your dump off is. You got to know where your shooters are. You got to know where your cutters are. You got to know all that stuff if you're going to drive into the middle of that lane. So same thing goes to Brad Stevens. If you're going to put this lineup out there backing up these guys and say, we trust them, we believe that they can do it, that's great. But you got to know where your outlets are. You got to know which teams could be moving which guys. You got to know who your free agents are. You got to know who your trade targets are. You got to know who you're willing to move. It's all part of the plan, and he's got to move on to that plan B quickly. More on this in just a second. Thank you once again for making Locked On Celtics your first listen every day. How about heading back over to that Locked On NBA feed and checking out the NBA Top 50 Most Valuable Players? It's a special podcast coming out this week with the Locked On Podcast Network and BetOnline odds makers. They want to know which NBA players move the betting lines the most this season. So check out the NBA Top 50 Most Valuable Players. You can find it on Locked On NBA, wherever you get your podcast. It's on YouTube. 3 Celtics are on that list. Every time a Celtic's on that list, I talk about his placement on that list, why he's should be higher, should be lower, should be just right, whatever. It's all right there. Check it out. So Al Horford, we're looking at preservation because he's just an extraordinarily important guy to have on this team. And so important that I kind of hope he gets re-signed at an appropriate level for next season. Maybe it's the veteran minimum. Maybe it's whatever it is, whatever that appropriate level is for next season. I hope that he sticks around because he's still valuable. Even as he progresses, I want him on this team. I want a pro like him on this team. It's very important to me. And I think it's very important to the Celtics. I don't think you just let him go. With the obvious caveat that if somebody wants to overpay him, just like Philly did, then you just got to say, you got to spend your money wisely. So what can the Celtics do to preserve Al Horford? What can Ime Udoka do to preserve Al Horford? That is going to be one of the keys for Ime this upcoming season. And it ties very closely, obviously, into, well, if Luke Kornet and Vonleh and Kabengele, whatever they can do, if those guys, if one or multiple guys are stepping up, then that gives Ime a lot of room to work. But what options does he have outside of that? Well, let's just say for a second that those guys aren't working, but you got to deal with it, and you don't trust them to make the plays to get out there. If you do trust them, then obviously the answer is, well, you just play Luke Kornet. If you trust him, you play him. And if you trust Vonleh, you play him. If you trust Kabengele, you play him. So that's fine. That's an easy answer. What if you don't? Okay, well, there are a couple of things that I think that Ime can do, and I've brought this up before, and I think it's worth bringing up again. Incorporate a zone defense where Al Horford doesn't have to move as much. That Al needs to, instead of switching, and I'll even add, don't switch. If you're going to play a normal switching defense, just switch. They'll call it like a 14. You switch 1 through 4. Or a 13, you switch 1 through 3, but don't switch 1 through 5. If you can, at least early on, in October, November, December, you just limit the switching, limit Al Horford's switching onto guards. Don't put him on the perimeter. Don't make him guard these quick guys and put him in a position where he has to expend a ton of energy. I know that that's not necessarily the heart of your defense, but when Al is on the floor, and I know you don't want to signal to the other team, hey, Al's on the floor. We're not switching everything. So, you know that pick and roll is going to be more drop coverage. You know that it's going to involve some other type of coverage. So let's take advantage of Horford being on the floor. you gotta come up with different wrinkles there. But I still think that preserving Al Horford is such an important thing that you just got to deal with it. So some zone defense in there to mix things up, not only to throw some different looks at the other teams, like I mentioned when I talked about the Ime Udoka Evolution podcast, but also just to give Al Horford a few possessions of still playing defense. Zone is still hard work. If you do it right, and zone in the NBA is still hard work. However, you gotta bite the bullet sometimes, and the health of Al Horford is one of the priorities of this season. So work in some zone, work in some different defenses where Al can stay kind of closer to home and not have to worry about getting out into the perimeter. Save that for later in the season. You're gonna have to limit his minutes anyway. I don't think I want to see Al Horford. He played 29 minutes a game last season in the regular season. So that should be down to the 25 or less, I think, which means, it's a 48-minute game. You got 23 to 25 minutes a game that someone else needs to fill in at Horford's spot. Even when Rob comes back, Rob will pick up some of that slack. Maybe it's more Grant Williams. Maybe it's more Grant in that particular role, and you do switch 1 through 5 when he's out there, and you put a lot of onus on Grant Williams to be even more versatile than he was last season. It's a big ask of Grant because he kind of needs to maybe be a little bigger to play down low and smaller to play on the perimeter, but this is what he's going to be asked to do. It's going to be a big ask. But playing smaller is one way to go. Losing Gallinari kind of hurts in that regard because he was a big guy that would have at least taken up some minutes. And now without Gallo, you have to go other routes. Do you go super small? I keep bringing up this super small lineup. It's in my head. The Smart, White, Brogdon, Jaylen, Jayson lineup where you're asking those guys to play defensively. You're asking them to do a lot. And you're obviously not doing that against Philly, right? You're not doing that against teams with the bigger centers. But against some teams, you're not going to ask Jayson Tatum to defend DeAndre Ayton. But if you see him switched onto Ayton, sometimes you're like, he's actually not that much smaller. So, and you don't want to tax Jayson Tatum either, but at least he's younger. He can handle the workload a little bit. But super small lineups, if you forget the center, go super, super small and see if you can run teams out of the gym and see if the switching and the tenacity and getting into passing lanes can be enough of a wrinkle. Again, we're looking for about 23 to 25 minutes of solution here to make sure that Al could be at 25 minutes or less for the game. That's what we're looking at the center spot. There are ways to do this to make sure that Al Horford has enough in the tank. But regardless, Horford is 36, and I think there's a real question. The question needs to be asked. How much does he have left, and how much do the Celtics need to do to compensate for that? It's going to be a question. If he comes back next year, it's going to be another question. And does he, do the Celtics decide when Rob comes back to go single big, maybe you bring Al off the bench. Maybe that's something that is a solution to making sure that he's going up against smaller guys, maybe backups. Maybe it's a little bit easier for him, and maybe that's the way you deploy him. At some point, that might be Al Horford's future anyway. There are a lot of options, but the Celtics a priority to preserve him because he's just so important to what this team can do. And I think if the Celtics are going to win a championship, they do need a contribution from Al Horford. I don't think you can move on from that. He needs to be a meaningful contributor. And that's a hell of a thing to ask of a 36-year-old. And eventually he's going to have to be phased out at some point because either he's not going to be back next year or he's going to be back and he's going to be lesser because he's going to be 37. And you're just naturally a little bit less than you used to be at 37. Sorry to say that, but that's true. So how far along the Celtics go before the minimizing starts to happen is part of this question. But for now, the Celtics, I think, just need this contribution. They need a meaningful, significant contribution from Al Horford if they're going to win a championship, and you need him to be ready for that run. So whatever you need to do now in September, October, November to make sure that he's ready for that run, you do it. Okay. You don't worry about it. Don't overly tax him now. Al Horford is the one guy that is on an extended preseason plan, and you ramp him up appropriately. That's the bottom line. All right. Unless something happens, we will continue on the camp questions tomorrow, which we'll get to number 6 and Malcolm Brogdon and him adjusting to his new role. That's the plan. But if something else happens with the Celtics, then we adjust the plan, because that's what we do. So make sure you're subscribed to make sure you figure out exactly what's coming to your inbox, what's coming to your device, and all of that. So subscribe wherever you get your podcast. Watch the show on YouTube. You can see me on YouTube. Hi, YouTubers. Make sure you ring that bell there to make sure you're getting this podcast alerts when I drop a podcast. YouTube gets the show first. I drop the show at midnight on the day that it publishes. So this is the Thursday show. Thursday at midnight, it's there for you. So the West Coast gets a late night treat. The morning show, the morning folks here in the East Coast, around the world, different times, but in the East Coast, it's morning drive. So you get different times. But on YouTube, if you really want to get the show ASAP, I drop it a little early on YouTube, so you can watch the show there. Make sure you're also sharing the podcast. Would love it if you did that. Share the podcast. Tell your friends. Tell everybody. They should be listening to and watching the Locked On Celtics podcast right here on the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.